All right, I'm going to say some words here that I don't want to say, but I need to say them in the right context, okay? So you know the phrase honest Injun, Indian giver, cowboys and Indians, expressions that over time had crept into our language. To many who say them, they don't really mean anything, right? Well, no, of course they do. And Wab Kinew knows all too well the power of words.
I'm not a Sun Tzu. I see no art in war. I believe in peace. That's what this pipe is for.
A successful hip-hop artist, journalist with CBC Winnipeg, and host of the CBC documentary series Eighth Fire, Wab took on his own bosses, the CBC, in a fight over a language issue. Are the children of residential schools simply called former students? Well, no. Wab insisted they're survivors. For Wab, that fight was close to home because his father, like more than 100,000 Native children, went to a residential school where he was brutalized and terrorized. To Wab, his father wasn't merely a former student. He was a survivor. And for the sake of those who survived, Wab wanted Canadians to know that the story of Aboriginal people today isn't limited to the words and the pictures that we've become accustomed to. Images of people in crisis in Aboriginal and Inuit communities like Attawapiskat, Kashechewan, and Davis Inlet. Pictures that send a message to Native and non-Native Canadians that the only relationship these two groups have is one based on charity. Eighth Fire is trying to change that. Its premise, Native and non-Native Canadians can have relationships based on mutual trust and benefit.
Now is the time for your people and my people to come together and build a new fire of peace and friendship.
Wab calls himself an ambassador for First Nations people and says it's about time that Canadians, all of us, figure this relationship out.
It's been 500 years. It's time to fix it.
Really excited for this. Please welcome the show, Wab Kinew. All right, man. Nice to see you.
Real good, real good. Hey, hang on a second.
Yeah.
I brought you a gift.
Oh, that's awesome, dude.
Your audio person is going to hate me as I put this around your microphone.
Done.
But this is a bear claw necklace that my Sundance brother, Leonard Crodock Jr., gave me.
It's
and
beautiful.
he gave it to me this summer at our Sundance because we were having a really strong ceremony, and he wanted to recognize me for, like, you know, doing good in our community. I've been watching you for a while, and I wanted to give that to recognize you for doing good in all of our community.
You're very kind, man. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. It's beautiful, man.
Do you feel the spirit of the bear coursing through your veins?
Well, I actually feel the claws of the bear. This is beautiful. I'm only going to take it off because of the microphone. That's it.
Absolutely.
Right there. I was like, what? This is just so beautiful.
I wanted to give you the gift to start off because Aboriginal people are, you know, known for being generous.
I appreciate that.
I don't know how we got the whole Indian giver thing. I'm going to need that back at the end of the show, by the way.
This is exactly what you're going to get in things like Eighth Fire as well. Talk to me about this project and why you wanted to get involved, because it is a very different take on this story.
Basically, the show is making the case that now is the time to fix the relationship between Aboriginal people and the rest of Canada. I mean, for too long, we've been taught and made to believe that, you know, Native people can only succeed at the expense of non-Native people, and non-Native people can only succeed at the expense of Native Canadians. But that's just not true. I mean, nowadays, we live in a time where our interests coincide. Canada has a booming economy based on natural resources, and they need workers. So I think now is the time to fix those things. I'd much rather live in a country where everyone's a neighbor, where everyone is positive and working towards a brighter tomorrow. And that's the case we're trying to make in this series.
Is this something you feel responsibility to do?
I do. Like, it's being the ambassador, so to speak, for Native people is not something I shy away from. Like, I feel like my whole life I've been pushed towards that by my family, by my community, and stuff like that.
Well, didn't you, when you were young, they forced you to address large groups? They really made sure, your family, that you were out there learning how to communicate.
Yes. My dad was a Grand Chief of Northwestern Ontario when I was growing up, and he would put me on stage in front of crowds of people to, you know, speak about what it's like to be a young Aboriginal person. Growing up, my mom took me to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, and, you know, all that to say that what I'm doing now isn't so far removed from that. Like, I feel like there is a misunderstanding. My people aren't understood well by the rest of Canada, and it's not because Canadians are bad people. Canadians are good people. Canadians have open hearts and open minds. It's just a question of the information not getting through. So I'm trying to do it in a way that's compelling. I'm trying to do it in a way that's interesting, in a way that doesn't make anybody feel guilty, and allows us all to sit together and, you know, work through some difficult issues.
What do you think the conversation that people are having about scrapping of what's been called the Indian Act?
I say get rid of the Indian Act entirely. Like, I mean, the idea that, first of all, like, anywhere in the world, when you take one group of people and you put them off aside from the rest, that never works. It never seems to work anywhere in the world. So I don't know why we expect that it's still going to work in Canada to this day. I know there's a lot of fear about what would come after the Indian Act. A lot of chiefs are afraid, oh, what's gonna happen to our funding? What's going to happen to our rights as they're currently recognized? I say don't be afraid. You know, like, the only thing we have to lose is our status cards.
Some friends of mine who are either identified as or identify themselves as First Nations say that, you know, there's a lot of drama that goes on in reservations with chiefs and with just individual corruption, and then you have other people on the outside who say you have responsibility as well to fix something.
No, absolutely we do. I think the biggest change that has to happen is that the value of education has to be recognized, particularly achievement in math and science. Like, I mean, when I studied calculus in university, my friends are looking at me like, my Native friends were like, what are you doing? Like, why are you studying that? When are you going to use that? I mean, if we want to succeed in a world competing against China, against India, against a world dominated by technology, I mean, we're going to have to pick these things up.
And the good news is, even if you don't ever apply your calculus, you're no different than anybody else. Anybody who studies that has no idea.
I'm glad you did not ask me to tell you what a derivative is.
No, dude. I could explain it in terms of stocks if you want. That's what I think is an interesting part. I've heard some people in the First Nations community talk about how the way to start building the bridge between the two is to speak only in terms of economy and financially, because that's a common language. It's almost an unemotional language. And that there's mutual benefits here if economy becomes a part of the conversation.
Well, for us, I think economics trumps politics. I think that's a truism no matter where you go in North America. And what I've always believed for myself is that, you know, sovereignty or self-sufficiency as a First Nations people would come not from Ottawa granting it to you, or not from you declaring it for yourself, but from building up your economic base so that you have the freedom to do what you want. And I think when non-Native people see Native people making money for themselves and making business for themselves, I think they respect that. And I think they say, like, hey, these guys know what they're doing. Let's do business with them together.
Do you think non-First Nations Canadians care about this story?
I would say diplomatically.
So that means no, you don't.
They do when it affects them. And the case that I'm trying to make is that it always affects us together. I'll give you an example. I told a story on The National about my father's experience with residential schools. And
your father was brutalized.
He was raped by a nun, you know. There's no way around it. When it is a dark-skinned Native man telling his story with black and white photos from another generation, I don't think that the average Canadian relates to that. When I told this story, I put my son in front of the camera, and he's fair-skinned and he's 5 years old. And I started to wonder, what if, you know, I look at my son and now he's the age that my dad was when he was taken away. Could he handle the beatings? Could he handle the other things that I don't even want to think about? And I think when a non-Native Canadian sees that, they see somebody who looks like their son, who looks like their grandson, then all of a sudden, holy cow, that's what happened to these people. Yeah. And that's what I'm talking about. When we get past these barriers, these fences that divide us, we have a lot in common.
But you changed the language, and I think that's important. You were part of making sure that kids who were in the residential schools weren't called students, but they were called survivors.
Survivors, yeah. There was like this whole thing internally here at the CBC. There was an edict that came out from the journalism policy people here that said that people are not supposed to be referred to as survivors. They should be former students of residential schools. And then they gave their rationale was essentially that survivors has a very strict definition from the Webster's Dictionary. And it was that survivors are people, plants, or animals that, you know, live on past others of their kind past a disaster. That's not verbatim, but that's basically it. And for me, being somebody who's working as an ambassador for CBC in the Native community, I couldn't accept that, because what you're saying is that my dad, my uncle, my cousins, everybody in my family who went to these places, they don't know their experience. We're going to tell you what happened to you, okay? Yeah. Because you don't understand your own story. Here's the word, here's the language to describe what happened to you. And so I stood up and I said, no, that's not right. And I basically, tendered my resignation. I said, if
it's a big card to play, man.
Well, yeah, I go hard or I go home. It was like, but that's how I felt. Like, for me, this was a test. Is the CBC going to be a place that, is diverse in the fact that we put brown people on the air, but everybody just has to act white? Yeah. Or are we going to be a place that is truly diverse in that we change our reality to encompass other Canadians' experience?
Stick around. More with Wab Kinew right after this. That's great.
Never see tomorrow, this my last word and testament. First of all, I say miigwech for the best of it. Creator gave me some and my fam gave the rest of it. I hope I did you proud and gave my boys the elements that they need to succeed and didn't leave impediments. I hope they mother knows she helped in my development.
Welcome back here. We're hanging out with Wab Kinew. You're not just a journalist, you're also a rapper. What was the first experience with hip hop that you had?
My hip-hop experience started when I was like 8 or 9 years old, and I used to listen to Vanilla Ice and MC Hammer, and then Too Short and De La Soul.
Wow, see,
and I couldn't really...
Now, Hammer to Too Short, that's a very different...
I couldn't tell the difference at 9 years old. I was like, hey, it's rap, I like it. All right, it's all good. Now, in hindsight, obviously, I realized that, MC Hammer is... clearly the way to go, and what I should have been focusing more of my time on.
You were young, but could you identify at that time that hip-hop was an incredibly important tool for a people that were oppressed?
That came later, more when I was a teenager. As a kid growing up, you just hear all sorts of music, rock and roll, hip-hop, everything. And I still listen to all those different forms of music now. But when I became a teenager, I started reading. A lot of more radical stuff. I started reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. I started reading God is Red by Vine Deloria. I started reading all these different things, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee by Dee Brown.
Heartbreaking.
It's the heartbreaking tale, the true story of the American West. And basically, that's when I realized, hey, this music that I'm listening to, guys like Nas, who are putting, their experience and, their knowledge into words, and they're speaking passionately,
Are people uncomfortable when they don't know how to address you? Do they know? One of the conversations is, because I heard you say the word Native and First Nations and Métis are different, and, what's how do you want just in future if somebody sees you on the street, hey, that's Wab?
Hey, Wab Kinew.
That's it, yep.
Don't go, hey, Indian. That's not gonna work.
People don't still do that to you, do they? You don't get that now, do you?
No, it's funny. I used to get that when I was a little 6-year-old kid at the hockey rink, but seriously? I don't get it now that I'm 6'1" and 200 pounds.
Hey, Indian.
Times have changed. Yeah. But no, it's a legal thing. Okay? Aboriginal means all-encompassing. First Nation means somebody with a status card. Métis means either somebody who's a product of a mixed relationship or somebody who's a descendant from Louis Riel's people. Right. Inuit are the Inuit people who live in the north. So there are legal descriptions. For myself personally, I don't think anybody should be using the word Indian. Mm-hmm. It's just, it's a word that's been sullied by the way it's been used in Canada.
In the way that African-American artists use the N-word in their raps, you
know what we say? Yeah. I know where you're going. We have an N-word of our own,
but
it's not Indian.
No.
It's Nietzsche.
Nietzsche.
It means brother. It means friend in our language.
But is that derogatory?
It's not derogatory at all.
So it's okay. So if a white guy says
But I just mean that's the word that we use
That's
in
your
our
N-word.
slang.
Okay,
yeah.
Gotta check it out. Doc Zone series, 8th Fire airs right here on CBC. Watch it Thursday night. You don't want to miss it. Wab Kinew, everybody. We'll be right back.
We were having a really strong ceremony, and he wanted to recognize me for doing good in our community. I've been watching you for a while, and I wanted to give that to recognize you for doing good in all of our community.
You're very kind, man. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. It's beautiful, man.
Do you feel the spirit of the bear coursing through your veins?
Well, I actually feel the claws of the bear. This is beautiful. I'm only going to take it off because of the microphone. That's it.
Absolutely.
Right. I was like, this is just so beautiful.
I wanted to give you the gift to
fire. Wab took on his own bosses, the CBC, in a fight over a language issue. Are the children of residential schools simply called former students? Well, no. Wab insisted they're survivors. for Wab, that fight was close to home because his father, like more than 100,000 Native children, went to a residential school where he was brutalized and terrorized. To Wab, his father wasn't merely a former student, he was a survivor. And for the sake of those who survived, Wab wanted Canadians to know that the story of Aboriginal people today isn't limited to the words and the pictures. It's about time that Canadians, all of us, figure this relationship out.
It's been 500 years. It's time to fix it.
Really excited for this. Please welcome the show, Wab Kinew. All right, man. Nice to see you.
Real good, real good. Hey, hang on a second.
Yep.
I brought you a gift.
Oh, that's awesome, dude.
Your audio person is going to hate me as I put this around your microphone.
Done.
But this is a bear claw necklace that my Sundance brother, Leonard Crodock Jr., gave me.
It's
and
beautiful.
he gave it to me this summer at our Sundance because...
that we've become accustomed to. Images of people in crisis in Aboriginal and Inuit communities like Attawapiskat, Kashechewan, and Davis Inlet. Pictures that send a message to Native and non-Native Canadians that the only relationship these two groups have is one based on charity. Eighth Fire is trying to change that. Its premise, Native and non-Native Canadians can have relationships based on mutual trust and benefit.
Now is the time for your people and my people to come together and build a new fire of peace and friendship.
Wab calls himself an ambassador for First Nations people and says it's... All right, I'm going to say some words here that I don't want to say, but I need to say them in the right context, okay? So you know the phrase honest Injun, Indian giver, cowboys and Indians, expressions that over time had crept into our language. To many who say them, they don't really mean anything, right? Well, no, of course they do. And Wab Kinew knows all too well the power of words.
I'm not a Sun Tzu. I see no art in war. I believe in peace. That's what this pipe is for.
A successful hip-hop artist, journalist with CBC Winnipeg, and host of the CBC documentary series 8